Welcome to our discussion of Modern Love, the lives of John and Sunday Reid, the recently published book written by our two speakers tonight, Lesley Harding and Kendrah Morgan. Kendrah has been a curator at the Heidi Museum of Modern Art since 2003, after working at the Auckland Art Gallery as a lecturer in art history and in commercial galleries. Lesley joined Heidi Museum of Modern Art as a curator in 2005. Before Heidi, she held curatorial positions at the Art Centre here in Melbourne and the National Art School in Sydney, and she regularly publishes and lectures on modernist and contemporary Australian art. Modern Love, the lives of John and Sunday Reid, is the third book on Heidi's history that Lesley and Kendrah have co-authored, the other two being Sunday's Kitchen, Food and Living at Heidi, and Sunday's Garden, Growing Heidi. So, in the preface of your book, you acknowledge the wealth of other books written about John and Sunday Reid and the Heide Circle. Kendrah, what prompted you to write this book?
Well, it kind of grew out of the two books that we wrote together before, Sunday's Kitchen and Sunday's Garden. I mean, we're not biographers. This is our first foray into the genre, so we weren't considering writing about the lives of John and Sunday. But as curators and, you know, spending every day kind of embedded in the history of the Reids' lives and in the kind of magic of the place that is Heidi, we, you know, have a natural fascination with not just the art they collected, but what went on behind the scenes. And we kind of wrote Sunday's Kitchen because Sunday, as I'm sure many of you know, had a reputation as a fantastic cook, and she nurtured the artists that came to Heidi, not just intellectually and kind of emotionally, but also physically with her garden to table ethos. And anyway, as we wrote Sunday's Kitchen and talked a bit about, you know, what it was like to live at Heidi and what the daily routines were like, we've discovered a lot about the garden, and that led into the book about the development of the property. But anyway, to cut a long story short, when we were interviewing many of the people who knew John and Sunday or their adopted son Sweeney, and a lot of them are getting on quite a bit now, you know, like Mirka Mora, for example, is 88 next month. Jean Langley, who was a close friend of Sunday's, is 89. Mary Nolan is 89. Some of them started to tell us other things about Sunday and John that weren't really out in the public domain. And I was thinking of an example before we came out tonight. Jean Langley, for example, in conversation about the garden, you know, came out with the comment. She said, you know, when I was in London in 1964, I saw Nolan and Mary, and Nolan said to me very sarcastically, I'll give my love to Sunday and tell her it's from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And so we started keeping this little dossier of notes, and I mean, it's a bit embarrassing actually, but we called it Sunday's Secrets. And when
why isn't that the title of the book?
That's a long story. Anyway, when we're up here, because we spent many hours over several years in the Reid papers, which is thousands of documents, and we've gone through it 3 times, we also kept discovering, we were looking for things about the garden or about food, and we kept discovering other things. You know, we'd be like, you know, this note from Barry Reid to, you know, Nolan is written in 1948. That's right when Nolan, I'm jumping the gun here a bit, but right when Nolan had left Heidi and just before he married Cynthia and so forth. And so the dossier got bigger and bigger. And really, when we talked to Sally Heath, our publisher at MUP, about all these things we discovered, it really just kind of sealed the deal, and we started from there. So it was, the beginning of it all.
Lesley, for those who are familiar with the story of the Reids, what kind of stories or new information have you uncovered in Modern Love?
Yeah, you're right, actually, George. They are well-trodden stories in some ways, but I think really people know most about the 1940s period, though, the halcyon days when, you know, people like Sidney, Nolan and Albert Tucker and Joy Hester and Arthur Boyd were hanging out at Heidi. So that part of it is actually well-known, but there are other parts that are less well-known, and we actually had to do quite a lot of digging around, a lot of primary research on people like Leonard Quinn, Sunday's first husband, so we discovered some new details about him. But we also, for the first time, I guess, contextualised the Reids' contributions across their whole lives. So, I mean, there are lots of little things that we discovered, but in a larger sense, I think, just by talking, like delving into things like, you know, their contributions to the Museum of Modern Art and Design of Australia and the Gallery of Contemporary Art and later the Contemporary Art Society, those parts haven't really been looked at and fleshed out in the same way. In piecemeal, yes, in catalogue essays and things like that, but and certainly things to do with their life with Sweeney. There's a lot of new information there, some of which we couldn't put in the book, unfortunately.
And we did. So I was going
to. You found a treasure trove of interviews, which is exciting for any historian.
I just remembered that you were interested in those. Yeah, we're very friendly with an art historian called Richard Haese, who in the early 1980s wrote a very groundbreaking book called Rebels and Precursors, The Revolutionary Years in Australian Art, about the Heide Circle and those artists associated with them. Anyway, Richard interviewed all the key players from that 1940s period, and he intended at that time to write a biography at least of John and possibly a dual biography of them both, but he didn't, and he put these amazing interviews in his attic and really basically forgot about them. And when we wrote Sunday's Garden, we were talking to Richard, because he comes regularly to Heidi, he's a Heidi fellow, and we said, Richard, have you got anything on the garden, in your research that you did? I mean, just, a random question for Rebels and Precursors. I know it's a bit kind of left of field. But he said, oh, yes, I interviewed the Reed's Garden and Neil Douglas. I'll hunt out those interviews for you. Well, these interviews were fascinating because, Neil Douglas lived at Heidi from like 1936 to probably around 1940, 41. Part-time anyway, and then he was friends with the Reeds on and off throughout his life, and he had a lot of insights into what was going on then. So when we wrote the book on the garden, there was other information in there, and so we went back to Richard when we knew we were going to write this book, Modern Love, and said to him, Richard, you must have more interviews, come on. And anyway, he went back to his attic, and there was an amazing cachet of work that he'd done at that time, and he just handed it to us on. So we were very, very fortunate. None of it had been published before.
And some of them are still on reel-to-reel, so we had to borrow his reel-to-reel player and have someone actually transcribe them for us. And there was gold in those interviews. Some of the things Richard had told us, but many things he'd really forgotten about, because it was the late 70s and early 80s when he was doing those interviews.
Let's get stuck into the content of the book. Kendrah, remind us of John and Sunday's family backgrounds. What was John's childhood like?
Well, John had they both had fascinating upbringings, really, but John was the grandson of a Yorkshire postmaster's son. So he came from very humble beginnings originally, and Henry Reed, who was the name of John's grandfather, came to Tasmania in 1827. He was basically, out to seek his fortune, and I love the story that he walked from Hobart to Launceston because he couldn't afford a horse. And he started a kind of series of whaling and trading and sealing ventures, and in the end became one of, I guess, Tasmania's founding fathers. He owned a number of substantial properties in northern Tasmania around Launceston, and he lived between Launceston and England for most of his life. And he bought this magnificent property in the 1870s called Mount Pleasant, which still exists. It's now owned by a Belgian champagne maker. And we were lucky enough to be taken to this property by John Reed's nephew. Anyway, his youngest son, he had two families, and he had 11 children, and I think it was 11 in total, and John Reed's father, Henry Jr., was the very youngest. And although the estate was entailed, Henry Reed Jr.'s older brother, Walter, from the second family, was the black sheep, and he had died in mysterious circumstances in a brothel in London. And Kenneth von Bibra, John Reed's nephew, always said to us, I just hope he was coming out of the brothel and not going into it. Anyway, there were lots of funny stories like that. But Henry Jr. Inherited the estate, and he married a beautiful girl from the Orkney Islands called Lila, and Lila Borwick Denison. And anyway, John was born in 1901, and he had several siblings, and the youngest one, who also plays a role in the story, it was Cynthia, who was known as Bob to the family. But John, the kids were mostly all sent off to boarding school in England when John was 8. So he went to Pinewood in Farnborough, then Cheltenham, where Patrick White went, and he, it was quite a arduous ordeal going to boarding school. In England anyway, they didn't see their parents more than once in 5 years, and then they came back with the outbreak of World War I, and then he went to Geelong Grammar, and that was quite arduous too, because he was bullied because he seemed so English when he came home. But he really discovered himself in Cambridge, where he was sent to study law because a phrenologist had examined his head when he was very young and said that the shape of it was eminently suited to studying law. But he had a very strict strict religious upbringing too. The family were devout. The grandfather had been Wesleyan, and John Reed's father was Presbyterian, and they all had to learn. The kids had to learn Psalms on Sundays and recite them, and if they didn't recite them, they got a belting. But it was quite a rural lifestyle. They, rode horses and so forth. John developed his love of bird watching as a child, and so it was very different to Sunday's upbringing, because she, as a member of the Beaulieu family, and by the time she was born in 1905, the Beaulieus had really risen to quite a social and kind of financial prominence in Melbourne. And her grandfather also came from humble beginnings, and when he came out in 1853, but she had a much more cosseted kind of family upbringing. She was schooled at home, she had a governess, she learnt French because her mum was a Francophile, she played the piano and so forth, and then she went to St Catherine's for a couple of years when she was older. But she really, it was her first marriage that really kind of meant that she lost her innocence, if you like, and was introduced to kind of the broader world and the reality of the broader world, where I think John was probably a little bit more worldly by the time he met Sunday.
Tell us a bit more about her first husband, the American Leonard Quinn.
Yeah, we call him the dastardly Leonard Quinn because he was a bit of a rascal.
He was a cad.
He was a cad,
a bounder.
He was very much on the make, and he came out to... Well, we did have to dig around on passenger lists and births and deaths records to try and find out some more details about this very elusive character. He came out to Australia in 1923. And what was it, 1919? Anyway,
need to reread the book.
The dates are slipping now. It's been a while. So he came out to Australia with his father, who was a Northampton shoe dressings manufacturer, of all things, and I suspect they came out on a business trip. But anyway, Leonard decided to stay, and he quickly made his way down to Melbourne and ingratiated himself in the social set in Toorak and South Yarra, and was renowned for being a foxtrot dancing champion. But very soon, when you go through that wonderful resource trove, when you go through and do various searches on Sunday Beaulieu, her name comes up an awful lot in the social pages. And of course, when you about Leonard Quinn, and there, of course, his name appears at the same time. So we know, for example, that at her coming out dance, he was in attendance, and it was a romance that was discouraged by the Beaulieus. In fact, they did some surreptitious research into the background of this fellow, and I think they really had decided he was not particularly worthwhile. He didn't show any signs of wanting to work, and certainly he had his eyes set on Sunday as someone who had a personal income. By the time she was 21, her father had a series of settlements in her name, so she had a private income, which was, I guess, very appealing. And in an effort to dissuade Sunday from the romance, the Beaulieus decided to take her over to London and present her at court. So that was a year-long trip, and the romance must have continued. There are no extant letters, and all we know about Leonard Quinn in that intervening period is that he managed to, and Kendrah will verify how difficult this is, managed to get lots of speeding offences in Auckland, in and around Auckland.
In 1924.
In 1924. It's kind of hard to imagine, but that's the only kind of way he appears publicly. And by the time Sunday had turned 21, of course, she decided that she didn't need her parents' consent and she would marry him anyway. And it all happened fairly quickly. After she came back, her elder brother died. The family was in mourning. We think she snuck away to Sydney to go and visit Leonard, and they decided to get married. And I mean, the proof is in the pudding in many ways, because the Beaulieus, you would expect, would have liked to have thrown her a very lavish wedding. I mean, taking your daughter to be presented at court cost many, many thousands of pounds in those days. But instead she was married in a seaside Catholic chapel down at Sorrento, and the only people in attendance were the immediate family and a very dear friend of hers. And in fact, one of her favourite cousins, Bobsy, turned up. Well, she had a party. That was a New Year's Eve. She had a party that night, completely unaware that Sunday was being married. And when she turned up to visit Merthyr and see Sunday, she was Mrs. Leonard Quinn. Big shock to the whole family. And the two of them pretty quickly got out of there. They packed up and went to Sydney, and had nearly a year there before they went over to the UK. And that's when Leonard really kind of got into his bad habits, shall we say.
Tell us about how the marriage ended.
So really, it's really the first great tragedy in Sunday's life, other than the death of her brother. They were travelling around France and had found themselves in Paris. Sunday was quite well connected with the expatriate set there, but he had somehow, or she found herself in a great deal of pain in a Paris hospital and undergoing an emergency hysterectomy because he'd infected her with gonorrhea. And we didn't know this until we had a talk to Merca about it, but tragically she was pregnant at the time. Well, that's what she told Merca. So that completely dashed all of her hopes of having a family of her own, and naturally the marriage was completely over. So her brother and father, who were still in London, they'd gone over to make a trip, I think, to check up on Sunday. They came over and kind of took her back to London. She recovered in the bosom of the family, and then they made their way back to Melbourne, and not that long after she met one John Reid.
That's right. They met in 1930 and they got married in 1932. Kendrah, how did this couple, both from very establishment families, how did they get caught up with these bohemian artists?
Well, a key figure actually in their early relationship was Cynthia, John Reid's younger sister, who'd moved to Melbourne shortly. Well, John Reid came back from Cambridge and he worked for the law firm Blake and Wriggle, and he lived in a boarding house, and the owner of the boarding house moved in kind of more bohemian circles than he'd previously kind of encountered, and he began to get a bit of an interest in modern art, although he still wore a bowler hat, didn't he, to breakfast, and because he flattered with Fred Ward, the furniture radical, quite avant-garde furniture designer, and Fred Ward remembered him wearing his bowler hat at breakfast, and Fred would be in his PJs, and he was still quite conservative and a bit uptight, I think, at that point, but he began to kind of embrace left-wing politics at Cambridge, and he did have a friend there who was interested in art and took him on an art buying trip across Europe. They were in search of a particular printmaker in Germany, and he brought those kind of experiences back. And then Cynthia moved to Melbourne. I can't remember the year, actually. Lesley might be able to help me here, but she was also a conduit to Fred Ward. She began to work for Fred Ward, who by this stage had a furniture shop in Little Collins Street, which Cynthia eventually took over. And Cynthia was really, I guess, more relaxed and experimental at that point than John himself, and she began to introduce John and Sunday to a number of artists and a number of interesting figures, including the progressive psychiatrist Reg Ellery, who plays a bit of a role throughout the 30s and 40s at Heidi. And anyway, Cynthia also introduced them to the kind of enfant terrible of the Melbourne art scene at that point, and a young artist called Sam Attio. And Attio had made a name for himself because he was at the National Gallery School, and he entered the National Gallery School travelling competition, the scholarship competition, and the painting he produced showed the gallery director, Bernard Hall, wearing a nightshirt and flanked by two nude students. And Cynthia, I think he put it under the title of Lot and His Daughters, as in the biblical figure of Lot. Anyway, it was ejected and rejected from the gallery school exhibition, and Cynthia decided to put it in the front window of her shop on Little Collins Street for all to see. So this is the kind of, I think that Sam's irreverence really appealed to John and Sunday, who'd already found in each other kind of like-minded individuals. They were keen to experiment and kind of move beyond the expected paths that perhaps their families had set for them. So Cynthia was important, and Sam Attio was certainly important, and he was really Sunday's first, lover outside the marriage, and they really lived with Sam very closely. They weren't living at Heidi at this point, although Sam was with them when they brought Heidi in 1934. But they lived in really what was, I guess, the first experiment in a ménage à trois. They were very close, and they, for a number of years, moved in a very close circle.
Can you give us a sense of what John and Sunday were like as people?
Kendrah and I have talked a lot about this because you can only glean so much, I think, from reading their correspondence. Sunday wasn't a great correspondent, in fact. She left a lot of that work to John, and John was very careful, I suppose, fairly cautious in his correspondence. I mean, there are a few people that he really lets his hair down with, but by and large it's sort of a business type of style of correspondence, and it's really... The reason why we have so much of that material is he started making carbon copies of things when he started up the Reid and Harris publishing firm with Max Harris and was publishing Angry Penguins magazine. And that's one of the great joys, actually, of the Reid papers in the State Library. Sometimes you can read both sides of the correspondence. It's a really quite unusual thing. But as individuals, Sunday was shy and a little bit capricious. She certainly, people say that she was the one who had the real sort of green finger in terms of selecting artists. And John was really the person in the background who made her wishes happen. So in some ways, I mean, you don't want to be overly simplistic about it, but she did have great ideas, and she was often lurking around in the background. It was often John, though, that would actually carry these things out. And Kendrah and I often discuss the fact that John had to put up with a lot with Sunday. She was quite moody, she was prone to temper tantrums, and she would take to her room and silences and things like that. And we kind of think that that's in part because she didn't go to school for very long and very late she went. So she didn't kind of play out those sort of social antics that most of us get to do at primary school.
She played them out as an adult.
She continued to play them out as an adult. Her parents really indulged her, and John continued in that way. I mean, but he was a good, almost fatherly kind of figure. And, yes, they were partners and lovers and all of that, but it was very much her, I think, that demanded this alternative kind of relationship. And, John worked really hard. He worked as a lawyer for a long time. He worked on the property in his spare time, and it's a big acreage. It's 14, 15 acres. Keeping that up, doing all of the gardening, milking the cows, because they committed themselves to a self-sustaining lifestyle. It was a lot of work. And then when he did retire as a lawyer, he then threw himself into the publishing firm. So, Sunday again was a guiding finger, if you like, in that publishing house. But it was John who really made things happen. And gosh, ever so patient, a terribly patient man.
I remember Neil Douglas in one of the interviews, The Gardener, saying that, Sunday could create a very heightened atmosphere at Heidi, and one wrong word from somebody and it would just splinter like glass. And then, Philippe Mora also told us, a very funny story where when the Mora boys were little in the 50s and the Moras had, befriended the Reeds, they would go to Heidi often on Sunday for lunch, and Georgia Moodie always said, whatever you do, don't mention the name Nolan. It's just don't do it. And the boys were fascinated by this, who was Nolan, like this. And so one day, of course, Philippe couldn't help himself and said, so who is Nolan, And Sunday apparently just did this Greta Garbo, and she just ran out of the room and wasn't to be seen for the rest of the afternoon. But she did often retire. She literally went to bed when she was unhappy with how the situation was progressing.
One of my favourite stories in the book was when they're preparing Christmas lunch for everyone on the Mornington Peninsula, and they've prepared a beautiful turkey, and the guests have the audacity to carve the turkey when they're not in the room, and she put herself in her room and she didn't speak to anyone for days. So beware if you're going there for food.
The disapproval was felt.
It's hard to separate their professional and personal lives, but let's talk a bit about their artistic patronage. So, as you mentioned, they bought Heidi in 1934, and it soon became a hub for painters and writers. What kind of patrons were they?
You go.
Well, I was just going to say they didn't like it.
No, I was going to say the same thing.
They saw themselves as fellow travellers with the artists, and I think that is, we were talking about what kind of people they were. I think for Sunday, very early on, and was really kind of stirred up by Sam Matteo, she really thrived on being close to the making of art. And she wasn't, she went to the George Bell School for a little while and tried her own hand at painting, but she was incredibly dissatisfied with what she could turn out. She thought herself insufficiently talented. But the next best thing, of course, is to sort of be standing next to an artist while they're making their magic. And so, as well as having the kind of eye for a budding genius, she also really guided the artists that she really liked and supported. So the artists were very much welcomed into the family, the Heidi haven, if you like, and it was sort of a familial kind of atmosphere. It was very strictly invitation only. If they didn't like you, you weren't invited out there ever. And there are sort of a series of kind of little tests that would be carried out. But it was this notion of being close to the making of art that in fact both of them really thrived on. And Sunday, I think, got her great highs and hits from seeing what was going to come back. For example, when Nolan was in the Wimmera and she's sending him up, preparing canvases for him, and they're talking about books that they're reading, and she's giving him some sort of instruction about him needing, it's really a missive, you know, you need to find a modern way of expressing the Australian landscape. You can do it, I have faith in you. And of course he turns out some of the best paintings of his career. He's not with Sunday when they're happening, but she's visiting him up there and she's giving him this sort of tutelage from afar. And I guess that's their patronage, if you like. It's a sort of a support system, not just in terms of emotional support and material support, but it's this idea that you enter into a relationship with them and then you can do great things.
And they were the same with Charles Blackman, actually. There are some very fascinating letters in the 50s about the time that Blackman's doing his schoolgirl series, and Sunday, you know, I guess Blackman filled a void that Nolan left, not in a, you know, they didn't have a sexual relationship, but certainly he filled the creative void that had been Attio, then Nolan, and then Charles Blackman, and that pattern was established. But Sunday's letters to Blackman amazingly have survived. They must have been left at Judith Wright's house in Tamborine, because Blackman was staying up there when Sunday wrote to him, and someone returned them to Barbara Blackman and she gave them to us. And we were so lucky because by the 50s Sunday hardly ever wrote letters, did she? Only John did. So we get her voice. But she's really demanding.
She was very candid. This isn't good enough.
She said, you know, the paintings all arrived and, oh, what a disappointment.
They say, I know you can do better.
I know.
This isn't very
But this
good.
is, you know, especially when I'm paying for it, she said. It's really funny, yeah. So she was, you know, she was really sending, like she did to Nolan and the Wimmera, sending Blackman materials and paints and so forth, and paying his dentist bill, which she also refers to. But at the same time, she was, you know, her expectations were high that he would be moving on and, you know, making a new direction with his work and coming to a point where he's painting significant images.
They didn't, as well as having expectations on the quality of the work, they wanted people to contribute as well. There were certain strings attached to their giving. Can you tell me about that, Lesley?
Yeah, Max Harris wrote a really telling letter. This is after he had decided to leave Reed and Harris. I think he ultimately found the whole pressure cooker situation of working and living often with the Reeds or staying with them too much in the end. And he had a number of personal things happening in his life too. His wife was having a baby, and I think he really felt the pull of needing to go back and be with family in Adelaide. But it was a really intense time, and they put themselves under a lot of probably unnecessary pressure. But he talks in this letter about about Heidi being such an idyllic place, but equally that things ran incredibly deeply, and you couldn't leave there untouched by them if you're a kind of a normal feeling person. And he needed space from them. He returned to their lives over, you know, eventually and over many periods. But that initial closeness that they had when he was a really young man, he was a bright, shiny young thing. I guess it could never be recovered because, and the Reeds did this a lot, they had fallings out with people, and sometimes in the case of Nolan it turned into great lifelong held bitterness, and for others they just really moved out of their lives. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why you do get these waves of artists coming to be supported by the Reeds and associated with Heidi, because as one generation kind of takes off and decides to move on, another generation sort of steps into the fray. And, you know, really right up until the 60s when they were working at MoMA, there were yet another younger generation of artists, and also people associated with Sweeney who benefited from the financial support of the Reeds, probably less so by that stage, the kind of, the intense involvement in their personal lives. But certainly there are people who hold the Reeds, continue to hold the Reeds very dear, and there are others who haven't got a great word to say about them.
Let's get to the bit that everyone wants to hear about, their sex lives. So, Kendrah, John and Sunday had a famously unconventional marriage, with both of them openly having other romantic relationships. And it began, as you said before, in the first year of their marriage. Tell me about their relationship with Sam Attio.
Well, so I guess I talked a little bit about that before, but I think it's interesting that Sam appealed to them, but in fact he was a bit of a prototype when you think of their relationship with Nolan. He was a working class boy from Coburg, lived near Pentridge prison. Like I said, he was irreverent, he was pretty bawdy, and in fact. but they really firmly believed in his talent, and they found him very energising. And in fact, Nolan later on was similar, also from a working class background and rough around the edges, but underwent a bit of a transformation, as he was associated with John and Sunday. But I think their relationship with Sam, introduced them to that, a model that they really followed from that point onwards, where, Sunday would take a lover with John's consent. And, John, we talked a lot about whether or not John was gay. We certainly think he had a close affection with a young man and a young academic at Cambridge, but how far it went, nobody would know. But when these, Sunday's lovers, particularly Attio and Nolan, came into their lives, John was very intensely involved too. It was more that, and really these people lived with him, so it was really truly a menage a trois. But Sunday and John also had a close relationship, and by all accounts they were very affectionate with each other and intimate. They certainly shared a bedroom. Lots of people have asked us about the sleeping arrangements, which has been fascinating. But they did have a share a bedroom at Heidi. But the beds were not configured, the bedrooms as they are now. And certainly, down by the river was a place of assignation for everybody.
Think about that next time you're having a picnic at Heidi.
But it actually ended up getting really.
It still happens there.
If you go down in the woods today. That's made me lose my train of thought. But
I was just going to say, Kendrah, that John would actually give Nolan and Sunday a bit of space in the morning. That was their time. Mm-hmm. And he would go and milk the cows, and he and Neil Douglas, when he was staying there, would walk down to the river and give them a period, before Sunday arose, and John would have breakfast ready for everybody. So, there was a certain, no one talked about it. In fact, Albert Tucker said, in an interview much later on, I had no idea what was going on at Heidi. It was all news to me. Nolan lived there, and I knew he was quite close to him, but he had no concept of the machinations and the kind of lovers passing in and out of John and Sunday's lives. It was very discreet, even though it doesn't seem it now because we've uncovered everything, but it was discreet at the time.
No, it did get a bit complicated. I mean, early on, John was so when Sunday was with Sam, John started to have a relationship with Sam. Sam had a girlfriend called Moya Dyring, who was also an artist, and so John started to have a sexual relationship with Moya, and that actually continued on. We didn't realise, but it went on for several years. So Sam and Moya both left Australia to pursue their careers in Europe, and they eventually married. And to make it even more complicated, I'm jumping a gun a bit slightly, but Sam ended up having a child with Cynthia, John Reed's sister, but no one knew at the time that Sam was the father. So that was another kind of added entanglement. But
I wonder how you kept track of all the different affairs. I feel like you must have had a whiteboard with all these
family figures. Like a tree, of everybody. And the surprise to us too was that Sunday was bisexual, so she had relationship with Joy Hester. And with other people who we didn't name for reasons that their family members still alive. But that was a surprise to us. That came out of one of the interviews, didn't it? Yeah. And also a long affair with the journalist Michael Keon, who was kind of in the mix at the same time Nolan was coming into their lives.
Well, that's right. Nolan was the most central affair, and you've talked about the Wimmera paintings, but in the letters between Nolan and Sunday, they fantasise about having children together, which, as we know, is impossible. But there was, some great fruit from their relationship, the Ned Kelly series. Can you tell me about that, Lesley?
Yes, I mean, the Wimmera period really was a lead up into the Kelly series, and I guess we found out quite a lot more about the surrounds of, the context for the making of that series. And Max Harris had a much bigger role to play than we had really hitherto realised. And he and Nolan, in fact, just before Max's daughter was born, went up to Kelly country and had, they backpacked up there, and in fact they ran out of money, so they kind of didn't eat on the last day and had to kind of hitchhike their way back. But they made this pilgrimage to Kelly country and sniffed around, which the locals didn't particularly like. And Max had this great idea that he was going to write some epic poem about Ned Kelly and really make his mark. And of course Nolan kind of got in first in a way. And Albert Tucker was a little bit bitter about this later on. He had also been interested in the Kelly. There was a whole, shift and interest again with a number of publications coming out about the Ned Kelly or the Kelly gang around that time, and Clive Turnbull had written a book and published a whole sort of bibliography of literature that surrounded it. So it was this rejuvenated interest. I mean, we all still are interested in Ned Kelly, but Nolan really took it to a new level, and he'd been painting the series for quite a period of time. But the series proper, I guess, is that set that was shown in 1948 that he selected. He didn't even see the show, in fact, because he'd by this stage gone off and married Cynthia. So he didn't come back to Melbourne to see the exhibition. But the series proper is from 1946 to 47. I suppose is among some of the great works from the whole set. But it's a work of it's a real milestone in terms of his career. It's a real milestone in terms of 20th century Australian art. But there were other things like Boyd's Bride series, like Albert Tucker's Images of Modern Evil. This idea of enacting a narrative over a sequence of paintings was not something that was original to Nolan. In fact, Tucker had done it before him, and but he sort of took it to a new level, and it became it defined his whole career. He went on and painted it forever after. When he needed a bit of money, he'd knock out another Ned Kelly picture. So it became like a bit of a noose around his neck in another, like a poison chalice in another way, because he couldn't really shrug it off. But of course, it's forever associated with the relationship with John and Sunday. And only a couple of weeks after he finished the last work, that's when he took off to go to Queensland, and that's a real sliding doors moment, I think, for the Heidi group, and with Nolan exiting, a lot of other people at the end of the war were travelling back overseas, but Nolan really at this point had started thinking about whether the Reeds could take him any further in his career, and also what his position in the family was going to be now that Sweeney had entered into their lives, and Hester had impressed upon Sunday the need to look after this little boy because she thought she was going to die.
And can I add one thing about the Kellys? I was just thinking too that when Nolan first showed the Kelly series in 1948 at Velasquez Gallery, Jean Langley, not Sunday's friend who's still alive, babysat the show, and virtually nobody came. And the only one sold to Clive Turnbull, and the series were just really didn't even make a mark on the Melbourne art world radar, let alone in a broader sense. But the Reeds undertook it upon themselves to promote it absolutely tirelessly. So the following year they took it to Europe and they showed it in Paris, and then they arranged another showing in Rome. And then in the 60s, when they set up the Museum of Modern Art and Design of Australia, they gave the Kellys, as part of a big gift of other artworks from their collection, to start the museum's permanent collection. They opened the museum with a showing of the Kellys. They arranged for a Qantas sponsored exhibition in 1964, and without their tireless promotion of the series, I don't think it would have achieved the kind of status of icon or the iconic status it has today.
They even tried to show Picasso, but Picasso ignored their note.
Yeah.
And they were promoting the Kelly series at a time when Nolan himself wasn't speaking to them.
That's right.
And didn't want anything more to do with them.
No, but they continued to promote the Kellys and Nolan's work.
There's so much we haven't covered yet, but it'd be good to reflect on their legacy. What did John and Sunday see as their greatest achievements?
Poor old John, when he attempted to write his memoirs in the 70s. In fact, he kind of had an offer through Geoffrey Dutton to produce a memoir, and he attempted it, and we painstakingly read his hand kind of drafted copy because he's got the most appalling handwriting. It took weeks. But anyway, he said in it, "I feel like everything I have done has failed." And he said, if it weren't for Sunday, I just feel like my life would be nothing. So, and when you look at it, I guess there is a litany of failures in a way. Some of the relationships, Reed and Harris ultimately failed, in Angry Penguins with the Ern Malley hoax. The Museum of Modern Art and Design of Australia ultimately closed its doors due to lack of funding. Everything he started, it did in the end fail, but it didn't. The legacy is Heidi, the museum that it is today. And also, you know, that's so typical with avant-garde activity. You know, if you're at the vanguard of what is happening, you know, it's not going to be accepted at the time that you're doing it. It's only later that people will be able to recognise it. So, I mean, I think their legacy is clear, and the fact that Heidi is a living museum, it's really going from strength to strength. It has an amazing collection, which is founded on the core collection of their private collection. You know, when Heidi opened, it was just Heidi 2, their second house on the property, and some of the property and some of the art collection, and now we think we're quite big. Yeah.
I like on the opening night, Sunday decided to stay up at Heidi 1 and didn't want to be part of the festivities.
No, it was typical of Sunday.
A bit shy, yeah. Lesley, what do you see as the lasting legacy of John and Sunday Reid?
Yeah, I agree with Kendrah. It's certainly their legacy is in the museum, which is, you know, it's internationally recognised. There was really some great art that came out of their patronage or their support, and I think if you look at overall, now that we can look back on the 20th century, if you look at it, some of the high points really came from the artists that they championed. So had they not got involved in the Contemporary Art Society, had they not decided to publish interesting avant-garde writing through Angry Penguins, if these things hadn't happened, you know, our culture, I guess, in terms of arts and literature, would be a little less rich for it. So whilst they didn't necessarily have a direct hand in terms of making products themselves, they were certainly very much there in the background, and they really put their money where their mouths were. They didn't have lavish overseas holidays, they didn't have expensive cars or jewels or anything like that, or eat out all the time. It was very much, they lived quite modestly at Heidi. It was a real philosophical approach, and they chose to spend the money that they had from their families and from John's work on the people that they really believed would make a difference.
And they backed winners, you know, Sidney, Nolan, Albert Tucker, Joy Hester, Arthur Boyd, John Percival, you know, and the list goes on, you know, very famous names in the canon of Australian art, and also the literary contribution as well.
This is the third book that you've written about John and Sunday Reid, and you've both worked at Heidi for many years. Kendrah, why are you still fascinated by this couple?
Because the truth is stranger than fiction. And we keep uncovering more things. In fact, the other day, we just had given a really fantastic archive. I don't think it's been announced yet, so I can't disclose what it is, but there was an interview in it that we'd never seen before that was done with Sidney Nolan in London, and he was talking about the period at Heidi, and I was thinking, I wish we'd had this for the book. You know, you're always going to discover, they did have fascinating lives. I mean, we do, and we have got an idea for another spin-off book from this one. We just can't help ourselves.
I did say, Georgia, this is my last word on John and Sunday Reid, but then, you know...
one more last word.
There's going to be one more.
Well, it's not just you that are fascinated by them. Why do you think, you know, we keep on coming back to them too?
I don't know. I mean, life is fascinating, isn't it? When you think, we often talk about how when a lot of the kind of the shenanigans, for want of a better word, were going on at Heidi, they were really young, you know. Well, there was a bit of an age gap, I have to say, because, you know, Sunday was, you know, considerably older than Nolan, for example. But, you know, everyone does, you know, probably more interesting things when they're in their 20s, or possibly they take more risks, you know. And the fact is that, you know, when those activities involve people who've now become really well known, it's fascinating to go back and examine them. But also the characters involved in the story throughout, all the cast of characters have continued to fascinate us. We're great friends with Mirka, you know, we love her, and she's just such an interesting person and always tells us something new every time we go and see her. I don't know, what would you add to that, Lesley, about why are we so interested? I mean, also working as curators...
It's impossible not to be when
you're working
there.
And living there. Every day we're in John and Sunday's houses. You know, it's all around us. Every day we're talking about an aspect of the garden they planted.
We do other things as well.
Yeah, actually, we're beginning to sound quite weird. We might have to stop that.
Modern Love is a double biography of both Sunday and John Reid, and just to further complicate things, it's written by two authors, you two. Tell us about the process of writing this book.
Well, happily, Kendrah and I write in a very similar way. So that's a good start. We get on very well. We're still friends after 3 books and heavy deadlines.
And we share an office.
We sit about this, in fact, we sit in this order, in this sequence, about this far away from each other in our office. We're very used to each other's company. And we also research and trust each other. I think that's a big thing, being able to trust that when you're going through primary material, that the other person's going to pick out the things that you're going to pick out. It's important. And I think probably one of the great joys of working collaboratively, or for me anyway, is that it really is a case of 2 heads are better than one. We get to bounce ideas. Kendrah is as invested in the project as I am, and that's rare. You can only bang on to your partner so much about what you've been reading in the State Library that day. You know, their interest wane fairly quickly, and you know, your friends and people that you exercise with in the morning, Sarah, hello. So yeah, it is great, and you do get it's an incredibly intense experience writing about other people's lives. You know, it's incredibly emotionally draining. So to have someone else to kind of say, oh, you know, to really just let your hair down with and kind of air all of your grievances about them is a really valuable thing. And look, the other secret that we have, and this is a trade secret about the way Kendrah and I write together.
That we're sharing.
If anyone wants to take it up themselves, is that we both work on we write different aspects of the book. We contribute to each other's chapters where needed, where one of us might have covered off a bit of the research, but we read the whole thing out loud together, sitting side by side, word for word, sentence by sentence, chapter by chapter, several times, and it takes, I don't know, quite some time, many hours to do that. But it does, things pop up during the course of that, and you know, it triggers things, you have discussions along the way, and for me that's a really rich and valuable experience. You're not in your ivory tower by yourself, you know, hammering away at the keyboard. You've actually got someone to go on a journey with.
Thank you. This is a question for both of you. Do you have a favourite spot at Heidi, either in the garden or one of the houses?
Yes, I really love the Heidi 2 building. I hate working in it. It's an impossible gallery to hang in, but it's such a beautiful piece of sculpture. That's probably I do love the gardens, and look, Kendrah and I probably are the first to admit we're not natural gardeners, and we learn an awful lot writing a book about the Heidi garden, I can tell you. It's to the point where when we travelled overseas. Where did we go, Kendrah? Sissinghurst. And we were able to name all the plants that were looking at the garden because they were the same.
I remember saying, oh, that's salvia.
Lesley lives in the inner city in an apartment, never had a garden in her life. So, I mean, the gardens are beautiful. The kitchen garden is a really lovely place, a really contemplative place.
Yeah, you cannot but adore Heidi 1 or 2 especially if you're interested in architecture. But I do really like Heidi 1 actually, because there's an atmosphere, and I've been up there and had a few, you know, kind of airy moments in the hallway and so forth. Heard footsteps. There are some ghosts up there for sure. That's what we think anyway. But I've got a favourite spot in the garden at the moment. The nice thing about Heidi is that. It sounds a bit morbid, but people have asked to, you know, have their ashes scattered there and things like that. And our dear friend, the photographer John Brash, who worked at Heidi since 1983, died last year, and we planted a tree for him down by the river. And at the moment, that's my favourite place, I have to say. And so you can have a little spot like that at Heidi. Yeah.
Hello. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about John and Sunday as parents and what the relationship was like with Sweeney, please.
Yeah, they weren't very good parents in some ways. They meant to be, they tried to be, but ultimately they made a lot of poor choices for Sweeney. Some of them were repeats of behaviours that they'd experienced themselves. So, for example, even though John didn't like going to boarding school far away from his family at age 8, they did the same thing to Sweeney. They sent him off to Geelong Grammar when he started becoming a bit unmanageable for them. So that's an example of the sorts of, you know, retrospectively, probably not the right approach for Sweeney. He wasn't that kind of kid who was going to thrive in that sort of environment. Sunday always wanted the child of an artist, and I think much like she had expectations of the artists that she supported, she had great expectations for Sweeney as well, and I think that was an enormous pressure for him. always living under her gaze, expecting, or with her expecting that he was going to create some, act of genius and produce wonderful work. And they're always trying to, they sent him off to England at a particular time too when he became unmanageable. Instead of sort of counselling him through things themselves and being as loving as they could, they were quite distant in a way. And there are lots of reasons why Sweeney took his own life at a relatively young age, but I guess one of them is the way that he was parented by all of his parents. And I'm not just talking about John and Sunday here, I'm talking about Albert Tucker and Joy Hester as well. It's a really, really sad story. In fact, that part of the book is, for me, the most emotional and the hardest part to read, because we found out things about Sweeney that we couldn't put in print, but it remains, I guess that's had a really lasting effect on me, what happened to Sweeney in his youth and when he was growing up.
And, Mirka said to us, because she was quite close to Sweeney, that as Lesley mentioned, John and Sunday always tried to do the right thing by him, but somehow inevitably they always got it wrong. And I think one of the main factors for me in that kind of chapter of increasing tragedies was that in 1960, when he was 15, Albert Tucker, who'd been away for 13 years, so nearly Sweeney's whole life, he'd been overseas, came back to Australia, and that year Joy Hester, his birth mother, died. And it was all at the same time, and that year John and Sunday chose to tell Sweeney that Albert Tucker probably wasn't even his real father. And that, to me, was just like, that was when he really went off the rails, and he began to be very difficult and steal Sunday's car, and he beat John and Sunday up. What they went through with him was incredibly difficult. It was not just teenage hijinks, but another wrong choice, and timing.
Hi, Kendrah, Lesley. It's Chris. Can you tell us what was their personal relationship with Barrett Reed? And a second part is, I worked on the library research project and was in the group that found a poem by, I think, Nolan, called A Fist Against My Heart, probably written when he'd broken up with Sunday. And also remembering amazingly sexual-looking photographs of Mirka in her undies on the beach. There was a heap of passion, really intense, big passion. Is there an example that you can give us of that? So Barrett Reed, and the levels of passion that they would have had around them?
Barrett's an interesting character, and forgive me if there are friends of Barrett Reed in the audience, but for me, reading, Kendrah and I have done a lot of thinking about this, and unfortunately his motives were probably not as wholesome as he made them out to be. I think he was fascinated by John and Sunday. It was a time that when he first met them, in fact he made the introduction in a way, because he wrote to them and waxed lyrical about angry penguins, and really I think he sensed that there was a part of this, a wonderful world. He was an aspiring poet, and he was quite precocious, and he wanted to be a part of it. And when he met them, he thought they were these most beautiful, angelic, ethereal people. And there was a kind of an aura around the Reeds, and he just wanted to be a part of it. And, yet I have no doubt that he really loved John and Sunday, but he did some really terrible things towards them. And again, as we were talking about earlier, sometimes these these acts of vengeance and things that happen in people's lives are because of the intensity of the love that they feel at certain times as well. And he sort of positioned himself as almost like a surrogate son, and certainly later on he very much took ownership of the Heidi story and the Reeds story, and a lot of writing that happened after they died is very much flavoured by the way Barrett Reed wanted the story told, I think. So we were at great pains to go back to primary sources and to make up our own mind about that. But Barry, we think, had a sexual relationship with Nolan when he was in Brisbane, which would have been seen as a betrayal. I mean, he more or less confessed this. There's a letter to John where it's kind of, he's just desperate to actually say the words, but he doesn't. It just kind of, if you read between them, it's oozing out between the lines, the fact that he'd had this sexual encounter with Nolan, and he really loved Nolan as well. And, you can imagine how complicated that makes your relationship with the people that you want to be in favour with. And, when Nolan's kind of weaving his way out of Heidi. And he also had an inappropriate relationship with Sweeney. And that's one of the great tragedies of the story. Do you have anything to add, Kendrah? It's a difficult subject for us to talk about. We've talked a lot between ourselves about it.
I know there's a lot there, but I didn't know what it came. And the passion side?
In terms of
Barry
Barry.
Barry and who?
No, separate. When I discovered the Sidney Nolan poem, it was intensely passionate.
Oh, it is.
It was called A Fist Against My Heart, and it was a screaming poem. Do you know of other examples of such?
Oh, yeah, there's all of Nolan's correspondence to Sunday from the Wimmera. Sunday kept it all. Unfortunately, she burnt all her letters to him, which he brought back from the Wimmera to Heidi and left there. And in the 1970s, when they nearly met again, but they didn't, she kind of ritually burnt them, which is... That's what it is, sadly. So we've got a one-sided correspondence, but there's no doubt that they were absolutely deeply in love at that point. I'd say from around late 1941 until probably around 1946, when it all began to be a bit complicated. And it began to be complicated partly because Sweeney had come into the Reeds' lives in 1946. And, even if Sunday was considering leaving John and going off with Nolan, she had promised Joy Hester that she would care for her child. And I'm sure she knew that John would make a more stable father figure than Nolan ever would. So there were kind of mitigating factors. But yes, it was a very passionate romance, and everyone who knew them at that time said the same.
And that passion for Nolan never seemed to die when Sunday had to return some of Nolan's early paintings to him.
That's right.
She put kisses and crosses
goodbye
on the back of these paintings. She loved the paintings, but
she wrote goodbye, kiss, kiss, kiss. This is 1957, sending them back to England to Nolan.
10 years after she's last seen him.
And she took it to the grave.
John kept pleading with him to come back into their lives, but they never spoke again.
You mentioned the use of primary sources and also the interviews. Did you approach both Sunday and John's families for input for the book?
Yeah, we had a lot of help from their families, actually. In particular, John Reed's nephews, Kenneth von Bibra and Henry von Bibra and their families, and they lent us quite a few of the photographs too for the book. And that was really helpful because you can imagine the process was a bit like putting together the most gigantic jigsaw you've ever done, and little bits were falling into place here and there. And Kenneth von Bibra took us on a tour, when we went to Launceston too, and talked about the family properties and things. And Sunday's family were very helpful too, particularly her nephews, Ian Baillieu and David Baillieu, who sadly died before the book was published, but he'd read the first chapters about the family history and was able to fact check for us in a really helpful way and fill in quite a few gaps. And there is clearly more material in the family that still, we're not really quite sure, but there's certainly some more information about Sunday's parents, Ethel and Arthur, and I think that's a bit of the jigsaw that could continue to grow. But they were very helpful.
There's also, just talking about primary sources, there are some papers that we know about that we can't access yet, and Kendrah and I keep saying, I know we've already said this is the last word about John and Sunday and Heidi, but I think there is going to be some material in the future that may want us to reshape, see another edition of the book that kind of fills a few gaps and patches in a few new things.
It's under embargo till 2025.
If there are any theft at the National Library of Australia, you know straight who to go to. Thank you so much for your company this evening. And
Thanks,
would you thank our panellists tonight, Kendrah Morgan and Lesley Haese?
Great.